Okay, nested conditionals. That's one of the code smells that I often see amongst junior and sometimes intermediate developers. So basically what I mean by that is a piece of code that looks like this. You have a bunch of if, else, and a switch in the middle and perhaps a loop. So the problem with these nested conditionals is they make programs hard to read, hard to change, hard to understand, and hard to test. The more nested conditionals we have, the more execution paths we have, which means we need various combinations of values in order to test a method. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you some really useful techniques to simplify conditional statements. Imagine you have a pattern like this in your code. So A is a Boolean expression, and if it's true, you're going to set the value of C to some value. Otherwise, we're going to set C to another value. We can rewrite this conditional block using the ternary operator in C#, and that looks like this. The ternary operator has three parts: the first part, the second part, and the third part. Note that these parts are separated by a question mark and a colon. So let's see what it means. We can read this expression as if A is true, that's the question mark, we're asking a question. Then what we have here, in this case, some value will be returned. Otherwise, what we have here, which is another value, will be returned and assigned to C. Let's see a real-world example. So imagine we have an expression like this. If customer.total orders is greater than 50, we want to set discount to 0.1. Otherwise, we want to set it to 0.01. We can rewrite this expression using ternary operator like this. So if customer.total orders is greater than 50, we want to return 0.1 and assign it to discount. Otherwise, we'll return 0.01 and assign it to discount. Note that you don't always have to use the ternary operator to set variables. You can use them to return values from your methods. Here is an example. So if you want to return different values from a method depending on some kind of conditional statement, you can rewrite that expression with ternary operator like here. Now, while ternary operator is a good technique to simplify conditional statements, do not go over the board when using them. So I have seen ternary operator used exactly like the example you see here in the real world. And an expression like that is so unmaintainable. Seriously, I can't even understand that. So the lesson is, do not apply it more than once in an expression. Here is another great technique which does not have a name. I just call it simplify true or false. Imagine here we have a condition here like A, and if that condition is true, we're going to set B to true. Otherwise, B is false. We can simplify this expression to something like this. So if A is true, B is true. And if A is false, B is false. So we can assume that B equals A. Want to see a real-world example of that? Here is one. If customer.total orders is greater than 50, is gold customer is true. Otherwise, is gold customer is false. We can rewrite this expression to something like this. So is gold customer is equal to the result of evaluation of this Boolean expression. Now here is another technique. Imagine you have two nested conditional statements like the one you see here. So if A is true and we come here, if B is true, then some statement is going to be executed. We can use the logical AND operator to rewrite these conditional statements like this. So if A and B are both true, then that statement is going to be executed. There is also another way to rewrite this expression and get rid of the nested levels. We can use the guard statements. So in this case, that statement is executed only if A and B are true. So if A is not true, we're never going to get here. So we can have an early exit. We can rewrite this block like here. So if A is false, we immediately return from that method. And if B is false, also we immediately return. If we get to this point, that means both A and B are true. Now here we can combine the early exit technique with combine technique. So in this case, if either A is false or B is false, we need to return immediately. So we can make this code even smaller, something like this. So if A is false or B is false, we return immediately. Otherwise, we execute the statement here. Here is another technique. So imagine you have a block like this. If A is true, and you come here, if B is true, then is valid equals true. Otherwise, if C is true, and here we have B condition again, then is valid equals true. So you can see in both these blocks, is valid is set to true only if B is true. So if B is not true, is valid is not going to be set to true. What we can do is to take B out and push A and C inside. Then the code will look something like this. So as you see, we reduced 4 if statements to 3. Now we can use the combine technique. So once we get inside this if block, if A is true or C is true, then is valid equals true. So we can combine these two if statements to something like this. Now we have only 2 if statements. And we can apply the combine technique again. So if B is true and either A or C is true, then is valid equals true. Isn't that cool? We reduced 4 if statements to only 1. And guess what? We can totally get rid of that. Remember we had a pattern earlier that if A is true, B is true, that means B equals A. So with that pattern, we can simplify this conditional statement to something like this. So we totally got rid of all these nested if statements. Now again, when you're using these techniques, make sure not to go over the board. So what I mean is, if your expression looks like this, it absolutely stinks. No one can read and understand an expression like this. So everything in moderation. As you're consolidating these conditional statements, do your judgment to see if the result is more maintainable and more understandable than the previous code. And it's always best to ask someone else for their opinion as well, because something that is simple and straightforward to you may not necessarily be the same for another person in your team. And remember my rule of clean coding. My rule is we write clean code for others, not ourselves. Most of the time we understand our own messy code. Our code is clean only when someone else understands it. So I strongly recommend you to ask someone else for their opinion after writing your code. Make sure to have someone else review it. Okay, now that you have learned some principles and techniques of simplifying conditional statements, let's get into the mechanics and see how we can do it in Visual Studio. Okay, the example we're going to work on here is nested conditionals that you can find in the solution under Nested Conditionals folder. So in this file, I've got a couple of classes, a customer class with a property called loyalty points, and a reservation class that in its constructor takes a customer and a date time. Our reservation class has a property called isCanceled and a cancel method. In the cancel method, as you see, we've got a bunch of nested conditional statements, and that looks really ugly. So we want to consolidate them. But before doing so, let's see what are the business rules. So here, this is telling me gold customers can cancel up to 24 hours before. So we check if customer.loyalty points is more than 100. Now here we check if the reservation is already started. So if that's the case, we throw an exception saying, no, it's too late. And here we have another if that checks if the customer is trying to cancel in less than 24 hours. Again, that means it's an invalid operation. Otherwise, we're going to cancel the reservation. We have a similar pattern, but slightly different for regular customers. So here it's telling me regular customers can cancel up to 48 hours. So again, similar as above, we check if the reservation is already started, then it's too late. Otherwise, we check if the customer is trying to cancel in less than 48 hours. If so, we say it's too late. Otherwise, we cancel the reservation. Now, when it comes to refactoring this kind of methods, unfortunately, ReSharper is not very helpful, and you have to do the hard work. Now, before changing any line of code here, what I have written is a bunch of unit tests. So, in the solution, you will see under unit tests project, I've got a class here called cancel reservation tests. So I have written a bunch of unit tests for various execution paths in our cancel method. And this is extremely important. If you do not have unit or integration tests, refactoring can be dangerous because you may break functionality along the way. So As a good habit, make sure to always write tests before writing your production code. This way, you make sure that for every single line of your production code, you've got a bunch of tests that validate that code. Unfortunately, I cannot get into the details of unit testing as part of this course, but I plan to create a comprehensive course on unit and integration testing in the future. So for now, let's just quickly go through the unit tests we have here. If you're not familiar with unit testing, it's perfectly fine. Just see what I'm doing here at a high level. Now let's do our step-by-step refactoring. So we go to Nested Conditionals. Let's take a look at our conditional blocks. The first thing that got my attention here is this block. If reservation is already started. So this block is repeated in both this block and this block. And we already had this pattern before in the slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this out and put that here. And of course, I can get rid of it here. So this way, I reduce one if block. There you go. And because it's only one line of code, I would rather to get rid of these curly braces. Now, before doing anything else, let's run our unit tests. So I'm going to run all my tests. All good. Okay, next step. Next thing I see here is this statement here. That looks pretty familiar. The only difference between this one here and this one is the number we've got here. 24 hours or 48 hours. So what I would like to do here is to extract a method, let's call it less than, that takes a parameter, and that's the number of hours. This way I can reuse that method in two places. Now, before doing that, I need to turn this number here, which is a magic number, to a parameter. So what I'm going to do is Control-Shift-R. I'm going to introduce a variable, call it max hours. And then I will select this Boolean expression with Control and W. Control-Shift-R. I'm going to extract a method. I'm going to call this method less than. And look, here's a preview of the method. So less than takes maximum hours and tells us if we're trying to cancel less than that maximum hours. So let's go ahead. So we replaced this instance here. Now let's do the same here. Now this one I'm going to manually change. Less than 48. Let's run our unit tests. Okay, so far so good. Back here. Another thing I see here is this conditional expression here. Customer.loyaltyPoint is greater than 100. The problem with magic numbers like this one here is the business rule is hidden, and that's why we have this ugly comment here. We can extract this into a well-named method or property and totally get rid of that comment. So what I'm going to do is I select it, Control-Shift-R, extract method. I'm going to call it isGoldCustomer. At this point, I have not broken any functionality, so all my tests should pass. Now we can get rid of this ugly comment. Now I want to make these two blocks, this one here and this one here, a little bit similar, so perhaps I can extract another method here. Before doing that, I need to fix this issue with this max hours because it doesn't look exactly like this block here. Here I'm directly passing a number here, whereas here I have a local variable. So let's inline that. Control-Shift-R, inline variable. Okay. Now these two blocks look very similar. So what I'm going to do at this stage is I'm going to use the combine technique that I showed you in the slides. So remember I said if you have two nested if statements, you can use the logical AND operator. So I'm just going to move that one here, if less than 24. Then I need to move this throw exception inside this block. Get rid of this comment and get rid of this unnecessary if because we combine the two. So if that's the case, we throw an exception. Otherwise, we're going to cancel. So I'm going to take this out. Let's run our tests. So Control T and R. Oops, I broke a test. Let's see what happened. So if a gold customer trying to cancel more than 24 hours, the reservation should be canceled. But that test broke. So let me debug that. What I'm going to do is I get back to my production code. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And now back to the unit tests. Okay, let's debug this one. So Control T and D. So for running a test, we use Control T and R. For debugging that, we use Control T and D. Okay, let's continue execution with F10. So let's double check everything here. Is gold customer? Yes, true. So we are a gold customer. So far, so good. Is it less than 24 hours? No, because we're trying to cancel the reservation in the future. So that's fine. Let's keep going. Now we are inside the else block. And here we are checking if it's less than 48 hours. And probably is. Let's go to our unit test. The test that has failed is this one. Gold customer canceling more than 24 hours. And the value I used here was 25 hours. So back to our production code. You see, because 25 hours is less than 48 hours, I think we are going to go into this block. Yes, and that's the reason we got the exception. So what we had to change here is something like this. Let's stop the debugger with Shift and F5. If it's not gold customer and is less than 48 hours, then throw the exception. Now let's get back and run our tests. Beautiful. Okay, next step. Another thing that I can see here immediately is ReSharper has grayed out this else block here, which means we don't need it. So I put the cursor here and we immediately see this yellow bulb. So I press Alt and Enter. And ReSharper is suggesting to remove redundant else. There you go. And let's get rid of all these ugly comments. I don't really like them. Okay, now the code looks interesting. So let's get rid of this extra is cancelled equals true. I like to make this code a little bit more expressive. What we can do at this stage is to combine these two if statements with a logical OR. So that will look something like this. So we have this original Boolean expression. I wrap them with parentheses like this. And now I say OR, and then come back here and select this expression. Put that here. Now we can get rid of this extra if. So if either of these conditions is true, then we're going to throw an invalid operation exception. Let's run the tests again. Beautiful. So I'm going to take this to the next level. I would like to extract the method from this and make it even more expressive. I'm going to use the language of the problem domain we are working on. So we select the code, Control-Shift-R, extract method. I'm going to call this is cancellation period over. See, this is more expressive than a bunch of Boolean expressions. There you go. Now we can put all of this on one line. Get rid of these extra curly braces. Okay, now the code is more expressive. It's talking to us. So if cancellation period is over, we're going to throw an exception. If someone is interested in the definition of is cancellation period over, they can go to this method and they can see this simple expression. Now, what we can do is do a similar technique here. See, this code here is very expressive. We don't have any kind of Boolean expressions, greater than, equal to, this kind of stuff. So perhaps we can apply a similar technique here. So the reader of this code does not have to think of now is greater than from. What does it mean? We can make it expressive. So we select this expression, Control-Shift-R, extract method. I'm going to call this is already started. And finally, we can use the combine technique again. So if it's already started or the cancellation policy is over, we're going to throw an exception. So I'm going to select this and put that here. There you go. And get rid of this if statement. Let's run our unit tests again. Beautiful. Okay, at this point, I think we can totally get rid of this is already started, because if is cancellation period over, it doesn't really matter if the reservation is started or not. So I think this conditional is redundant. So I'm going to get rid of it. And the only way to know if what I'm doing is right or wrong is to listen to our tests. So I get back to my tests. We got the same result without that extra check. So see, as we are doing these step-by-step refactorings, we can find areas of the code that are not required. And look at here, is already started. It's already grayed out by ReSharper, which means we don't even need this method. So let's get rid of it. Alt and Enter, remove unused method. Beautiful. And one last thing I would like to do here. This method is gold customer should not be in the reservation class, because it's not the responsibility of the reservation class to tell us if a customer is gold or not. This method belongs to the customer itself. In object-oriented programming, we have a principle called information expert. And that means we should give the responsibility to an object that has the data or the logic or the behavior we are trying to implement. In this case, the customer class has the data, has the loyalty points. So we should ask the customer if it's a gold customer or not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this method to the customer class. I can do that with ReSharper, Control-Shift-R, move instance method. And ReSharper kind of detected that I can potentially move this to the customer class. So I'm going to select this here. Next, it's telling me that the access rights for the member have to be changed. And the reason for that is this is gold customer is a private method in the reservation class, but once we move it to the customer class, it should be a public method, so we can call it from the outside. I confirm that, gone. Let's look at our code again. So now in the customer class, we have this is gold customer. We can change that to a property, and that's your personal choice. And now look at our reservation. Our cancel method is only 2 lines of code with a simple if statement. We started with 6 if statements and converted that to only 1 if statement. And that is very descriptive. This code reads like a newspaper. Now, what I want you to do is to practice what you learn in this lecture every day in your programming career. It's not always easy, the answer is not always straightforward, and sometimes it takes a bit of practice. But the important thing here is make sure to write your unit test or at least integration test before doing any of these refactorings. In this example, you saw that in the middle of these refactorings, I broke a test. And if I didn't have this test to tell me that I have broken code, I had no clue. And we could potentially deploy this application to the production, and maybe it would cause a serious issue in the business. Okay, that brings us to the end of this lecture. The next lecture, we're going to look at switch statements and how to refactor them using polymorphism. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and thank you for watching.